Hello, I'm Andrew and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at a league game that I played last week. It was standard time controls, so we had 75 minutes on the clock with 15-second increment, but this game actually ended in about 20 minutes. So I had the white pieces. I played e4. My opponent played d5, the Scandinavian defense, so of course I accepted the pawn on d5, which is the typical way to play this as white. And here my opponent can either capture immediately back on d5 with the queen or play knight f6, which is the modern variation of the Scandinavian. But they captured the classical way with the queen coming to d5, and now I kicked their queen away with by far the most popular move in this position, knight c3. So of course, now I'm expecting the queen to drop to either a5, d6, or d8. These are the typical squares for the queen to retreat to in the Scandinavian defense. And my opponent actually retreated to d8, which is the second most popular retreating square at the strong club level rating range, and the third most popular at the master level. Now, the drawback to the Scandinavian defense is that black loses a tempo in doing this. But later on, black is going to want to build up with the c6 and e6 pawns, clamping onto the d5 square. And white is going to want to contest the center by playing d4 and actually eventually c4, so that they can push into d5 and contest black's control of this square. Or after d4, they're going to want to play c3 to build a nice pawn chain, b2, c3, d4. And in order to do that, they're going to have to relocate this c3 knight. So black will actually kind of gain that tempo back, because white will need to spend the tempo dropping this knight back to e2 or e4 in order to facilitate this pawn push to c3 or c4. So I played knight f3 here. The most popular move in this position would have been d4, but a lot of these lines can just transpose into one another. Now here is where my opponent played a move that I thought was quite counterintuitive. They played e6. I can't find many examples of e6 being played in this position in the master database. At the strong club player range, it's been played maybe 7,000 times. It's actually the engine's top recommended move. But the reason I find this surprising and quite counterintuitive is that this is a little bit of a problem bishop if you're going to build up on the c6 and e6 squares. It's not going to have much mobility. So it's much more typical of black to develop the bishop either to f5 or g4 and look to trade it off for this knight, and then push e6, play knight f6, bishop e7. Or they could play knight f6 right now just to kind of see what white is going to do and then bring the bishop out and then play e6. So when I saw e6 being played so early, I thought it was a little bit of an unusual move. I played very naturally, just taking the center with the d4 pawn. And now my opponent plays a move that looked a little bit more normal to me, knight f6. But just notice that this bishop is now kind of shut out of the action because it's unable to develop with the e6 pawn being situated where it is. So here I felt that the best move was probably bishop g5. In fact, according to the engine, that is the best move, bishop g5. But I didn't really like the idea of, after bishop to e7 or h6, trading this dark squared bishop off and not having what is probably going to be my strongest bishop. Because again, if black is building up on the light squares with their pawns, my light squared bishop is going to be the weaker of my two bishops, as is my opponent's light squared bishop for that matter. So I kind of enjoyed the idea of maintaining a degree of flexibility by developing this bishop to f4, where it could support pieces on the e5 square, and also maybe target the c7 square if my opponent chooses to develop their knight to c6 rather than pushing c6. I might have some knight b5 ideas. So I wanted to kind of pause and not commit this bishop to g5 or f4 so soon. I wanted to see what my opponent was going to play. So I played bishop d3, which, as I was checking the databases afterwards for games that had reached this kind of position, I was reassured to find that this is actually the most common move played by masters in this position, despite not actually having the strongest winning chances. But it's a very solid move. And we're looking to get castled nice and early, and we're applying pressure on this h7 square. Should my opponent just go for some quick castling, I can maybe eliminate this knight and start attacking the h7 square with maybe some queen h5 ideas. I also wasn't so worried here about lines that might continue knight c6 and castles, about dropping this pawn, because of course, if my opponent were to capture here, this is just a straight up blunder, we can capture the knight back, and if they come for my knight, I have bishop b5 check, winning the queen, and if they play something like c6, I can actually just play this desperado move, ruining their pawn structure, gaining a pawn as well before I come and take the queen here. So I thought that bishop d3 was actually quite a nice move. The move I was slightly frightened of, which is actually the best move for black here, is c5. But c5 is quite a counterintuitive move to play in the Scandinavian, because by default, black is thinking, okay, I'm going to build up on c6 and e6. So c5 would have been slightly unusual, despite it being the best move. And actually, after bishop f4 captures, and the bishop comes down to b4 to pin the c3 knight, as long as you play knight b5, white's actually perfectly fine here. The only thing to remember that's really important is that if you get this position, and they bring their knight to d5, you can't grab the rook. Because after the knight takes on f4, black is actually just better here. There's too much pressure on d3, and this knight will likely fall. So you would just have to remember to take the knight on d5. And now this bishop is really lovely with a lot of pressure on h7. This bishop is great too. You're ready to castle, and you'll have a very strong game from this position. So I was a little scared of c5, but my opponent didn't play this in the game. They actually played b6, which is, again, incredibly unusual. I mean, the idea is probably to develop this light squared bishop to b7 and attack this knight, but by the time I'm castled and the knight comes to e5, this doesn't scare me very much. And there are maybe opportunities even to play queen e2 and slot the light squared bishop into a6 and trade off our bishops here. And yeah, I thought this was a slightly odd move, and also kind of a slow move. If you just played e6, you've played b6, but you've only got one piece developed. I already have 3 pieces developed, and now it's my turn. I'm going to castle. And in fact, that is what I played in the game. And now my opponent doesn't even play bishop to b7. They develop their dark squared bishop, looking to castle kingside now. So I just played bishop f4. The idea being, if you castle, then knight b5 starts to look a little tricky, because there's a lot of pressure on your c7 pawn. Castling actually would have been the best move here. And after knight b5, my opponent could have defended the c7 square by developing their knight to a6. But remember what I said earlier about white needing to spend a tempo in order to get c3 or c4 in? Well, now I've managed to position my opponent's knight on a6, and I'm going to play c3 or c4 now, and then just bring the knight back to c3, and my opponent's going to have a really awkward knight on a6. So I really like the look of this line. And similar kind of thing, if my opponent plays bishop to b7, I still have this knight b5 idea. And again, if they play knight a6, I can play c4, I can play c3, I can play a3, and just be very, very, very fine here. Because of this, because of my knight b5 response to bishop b7 or castling, I think my opponent chose to play c6 in response to those threats, because by this point I'd felt that the game was already won. The reason is I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces developed. I'm already castled. My rook's about to come to the center. And my opponent has 2 pieces developed and they're not castled. They've spent 3 moves moving their pawns. They've moved their queen twice. This just felt like I had such a developmental lead that I was going to be able to start generating some tactics immediately. And also, yes, you're defending b5, but if the idea of playing b6 was to situate your bishop on b7, your bishop's now not looking at anything until you advance to c5, which is maybe going to cause white some problems, but it's too slow was my feeling about the position here. So I just centralized my rook, and now a sensible move from my opponent would have been something like bishop b7, or even, I mean, it's still not great, but knight d7. Getting their pieces developed. I mean, even castling in this position is far too dangerous, because after knight e5, all of my pieces start to swarm your kingside. We have rook lift ideas, the queen coming into h5. I'm just far too developed. You've spent too long getting your king to safety. Too many moves advancing your pawns. This just doesn't look good for black at all. What my opponent played, however, in this position after rook e1 was knight d5. Now, this is now a unique game in the Lee Chess database. This position has not been arrived at in the Lee Chess database, at least not in rapid time controls. I wasn't looking at the standard or the blitz or the bullet time controls. But what's wrong with this move should be immediately apparent. Firstly, you've moved your queen twice. You've only developed 2 pieces, you're not castled, your other pieces are undeveloped, your knight can't really come out to a good square, your bishop can't really come out to a good square because of the awkward c6 pawn here. So maybe what my opponent is trying to do is look for this trade where they can bring the c6 pawn to d5 so that their pieces start to have some nice squares. But the problem is that, again, the c3 knight for white is a liability because they'd like to play c3 or c4. Now you're just letting me solve this problem. I'm getting rid of one of my least active pieces, one of my problem pieces, for one of your most active and developed pieces. So this just plays entirely into white's plan. Now, of course, I took the knight on d5, and there are 2 ways to recapture for black here. They can take with the c-pawn, or they can take with the d-pawn. The d-pawn is a bad idea because of bishop g5. This bishop on e7 is now pinned to the king, and there's not an easy way to deal with this. If you castle, you just lose the piece. You can't recapture with the queen because of the position of the rook on e1. So castling's not an option. So what else might you try? Bishop e6 is the best try because it breaks the pin. But now I can actually just support this bishop here. It's really annoying. And I'm kind of waiting for you to try and kick the bishop with f6, because then my pieces are going to start gliding in. My queen's going to come to h5 and check you. I'm pretty sure I can play knight e5 there. And after you take one of my pieces, after you take, something like this, the queen's coming in and it's going to be too strong. I'm pretty sure white is just winning here. Yeah, white is +5 here, and even if the bishop is taken, white is +8 because of these queen infiltration ideas, and it can't easily be blocked with g6 because the bishop or the knight will just sack here, and we'll be picking up the rook, and the king will be in too much trouble. In fact, this probably leads to forced mate. It's very similar to another move that I was hoping, if my opponent had taken with the e-pawn, we were going to reach. What I'd calculated was bishop g5 and f6, after which I decided knight e5 was a devastating move. The knight controls these very, very, very critical escape squares, so they're kind of forced to take the knight rather than the bishop. If they take the bishop, queen h5 check. If king moves over, this is mate. And similarly, if you block here, this comes with check. And if here, check, here, this is mate. The queen controls f8. The bishop is held by the knight. This is super lovely. I calculated this as one branch that we might end up walking down. Alternatively, if they take the bishop, well, now you don't even need to grab the rook. It's a little annoying because the bishop will just block and you won't have mate here, although you're still completely winning. What you actually want to do is just grab the pawn. There's nothing to interpose. The king must come to f8, and now again, queen f7, held in place by the knight, is checkmate. So my opponent really didn't want to take with that pawn because after bishop g5, everything looks really, really, really difficult to maneuver. So as a result of that, my opponent took with the c-pawn, which again makes a lot more sense because they're freeing up the c6 square for their pieces to come to so that they can try and get some development. Problem is now I just have this beautiful, beautiful outpost for my knight on e5, this gorgeous pocket. And the same problem if you play f6. I mean, queen h5. If king f8, we have mate. And if here you want to play, if here you want to play g6, well, check. And if here, here, here. We've seen this before. The only difference is that this pawn sits here. And again, if you take, coming in here, and we have mate again. It's the exact same thing, more or less. So f6 doesn't work. Castling really doesn't work. And my opponent in this position was, I could see they were looking at their king side and shaking their head, looking rather frustrated because, of course, they must have seen that if they castle, I just sack the bishop. And after the bishop is sacked, you either step over, and after like queen h5, I've got all these kind of discovered check ideas, so g6 doesn't even work here. This is discovered check. You're getting mated here. Or you take the bishop and queen h5 anyway. King must step back to its only square because there's nothing to interpose or take my queen, so the king's coming back. And now I calculated that rook to e3 is a game-ending move. There's no way to stop this rook lift to h3 and then mate. You can try and buy yourself a little bit of time by playing a move like f6, but now the knight hops into g6. And now I'm threatening still to bring the rook across and start infiltrating like this. And so, you know, if you want to move your king away to try and rescue it this way, well, now this is a double check. The knight checks, the queen checks, and the queen also looks after this escape square. So when the king rocks back to g8, we play rook h3 anyway. And we're coming in for mate on h7. This is just unstoppable. So my opponent quite rightly determined that they were unable to castle in this position. If you can't castle, what else are you going to play? Well, g6 is actually the engine's top move. But now, I mean, bishop h6, you're never going to castle. I'm going to be able to dislocate your rook. This doesn't look very attractive. I'm going to be able to bring my pieces in to attack this weak f7 square, and if you try and block it with your rook, you're losing the exchange, so that looks pretty nasty. That looks pretty nasty. If you just try and develop the bishop, obviously I'm not going to trade here. If I were to trade here, I would just be relieving the pressure rather than building it. The correct move to play would be, of course, queen h5, and now if g6, we just sack all day. We sack all day, and we win the piece. And when the bishop comes in to protect, I can play here, or I can play here. The rooks are coming in. We're going to pick up this bishop. This is really nasty. Therefore, the game is kind of already lost in this position, and I could really sense that my opponent had spent too long trying to develop, and that they were struggling to find a move. But the move they did play in the game, knight d7, huge blunder. This is game over. Now, if you haven't already found it, you can pause the video to try and look for it if you like. But the move is knight c6, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop. Most importantly, attacking the queen. The queen has no escape square other than c7, which is covered by the bishop. So as I picked up this knight and started moving it towards c6, my eyes came up to my opponent, who was smiling and shaking his head. He had obviously seen that he'd lost the queen. He sat and mulled over this position for a minute or two, deciding whether to play on, but eventually reached out his hand, and that was it. That was GG. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the Scandinavian defense. If you're white, how do you play against it? If you're black, what are your favorite lines? Do you play queen d6, queen d8, queen a5, or knight f6? Let me know. Take care, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.